Ladies and gentlemen, after the contribution we've just had there and building on where we were this morning in terms of making sure we create the conditions to feel listened to and valued, making sure that we have the correct supports identified and at the point of need when they need them without that waiting list, and ultimately with that sense of hope. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Charlie Irvine. Charlie is a big fellow traveller with the Scottish Centre of Conflict Resolution. He addressed our Inverness conference. And I think the big learning for me there was quite what we need to do for the front line. And if anything, of people who are on the front line delivering services, which is a phrase I don't like using a huge amount, but I think we all know what we mean. We need to get better at breaking down the cycle or getting the understanding around how can we break some of the stigma that is around the feeling of shame or guilt in talking about needing mediation, looking at conflict resolution. All I can say is from the Inverness conference, I took a huge amount in terms of what Charlie was addressing with us around the thoughts and feelings around conflict and actually getting deeper tissue than just the labels. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Charlie now. I'm padding slightly with technology, but I hope he will be able to address us and really give us an informed discussion that can help inspire us going back into looking after the next person that crosses your threshold who has conflict and thoughts and feelings in their lives. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Charlie Irvine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's certainly been focusing the mind all morning, the thought of standing in front of you. So I appreciate that intense concentration. I just read a piece of research yesterday that suggested that competitive situations or situations of social comparison instantly reduced everybody's IQ, which I thought was a really interesting finding actually for all of us. And then some of us recover and some of us don't. But anyway, I'm just saying, and I appreciated Sarah earlier kind of confessing to something of a rambling mind. I have one of those too. So I'll use some PowerPoints to hang my thoughts on. I suppose I want to start by saying I trained as a family mediator about over 20 years ago, as my friend says, in the middle of the last century. And one of the things that really caught my imagination right from the off was the term empowerment. This idea that mediators, like it or not actually, are not decision makers. They don't tell people what to do. They don't solve problems, and they don't have magic powers. They work alongside other people who in the end solve the problems. And it lodged in my mind, and it's lodged ever since. So what I'm going to share now are some ideas that have come my way. Unlike Sarah, I suppose I started as a practitioner, working with families for year in, year out. And then after quite a number of years, I fell upon some psychology, some other disciplines that I think I've learned a lot from. So I want to share with you some of the ideas that have come my way, but I make no bones about it. I am not a trained psychologist. I was once upon a time a trained lawyer, but I think I'm probably just about over it. But that's a lifetime's work. So just first of all, thinking about conflict, maybe another important thing to say is we are all our own laboratory. I think that's a very important thing I learned from the initial training. When it comes to conflict, every one of us knows how to do it. We know how to do it badly, we know how to do it well. That's a delightful thing, but it's also quite a scary thing. So much of this is it's as much about me as the people I work with, because we're all part of it. One of the things that I think we have to deal with in any situation with other people is what's going on inside their head. So this is one of the angles. I want to share a couple of ideas with you really that have come my way. What's going on inside other people's heads is of critical importance in life. When we're growing up, when we're very, very young, we need to know what those around us feel towards us, what their intentions are towards us. So when it comes to interpreting, you look at that picture, you can imagine fairly quickly, I suppose, something of what's going on inside those people's minds. Other situations are more ambiguous. what's going on inside her head. I actually found her as an example of resting bitch face. It's a phenomenon. But actually, another piece suggested that it's advantageous to have resting bitch face. It gives you time to think. What's going on inside his head? What on earth is going on inside his head? And what's going on inside her head? These are all mysteries. Only they know. And accurate as our guesses might be, there's a gap between what we see and reality. And in that gap, there's a tremendous opportunity for mischief. I want to focus on that a little bit. Here's a profound, simple, and rather ancient truth attributed to Ananias Nin, but I think it might be much older than him. It might be rabbinical. But it's the notion that when we're looking at the world, when we're trying to interpret other people's thoughts and actions, who we are is as significant as who they are. In the social world, that's how it goes. We are interpreting devices. We have mechanism for interpretation. We've got eyes and ears, a sense of feeling and so on. Nonetheless, we bring to the table ourselves. And I suppose a key question for all of us who work with conflict is, how good are we at interpreting other people's behavior? There's a quote from one of the founders of cognitive behavioral therapy. Some of you may have heard of CBT. Some of you may work with CBT. Aaron Beck was instrumental in the thinking behind that. And I like his idea that much of our thinking is afflicted by fairly predictable biases. In other words, the idea of a bias, someone explained it to me once being like a bowling ball. You know, if you do lawn bowls, the ball has a bias. So when you roll it, it doesn't go in a straight line, it goes like that. It would appear that there are some predictable biases in the way that we think, and the way that most people think, that are repeated and seem to have some evolutionary origin. They don't necessarily serve us well. And I want to focus in on one of them because I think it plays an extremely significant part in a lot of day-to-day conflict. When I first came across this one, although it has a fancy term, immediately it rang lots of bells with me. So that's where we're going to go first. I think I have to begin talking about myself as the laboratory of this. Some of my students are in this room and have seen this slide before and have heard this story before, so I apologize. I must really find a new one. But there we go. This did happen to me. So I was, at one point I was in a meeting at the university. I teach in a large university in another city. And I'm a fairly small cog in the system. I'm quite kind of low down the pecking order. So I was in a meeting and didn't have very many opportunities to speak. But at one point I was asked to speak. I was asked for my response. And while I was talking, a person quite a lot further up the pecking order than me was looking at his phone. Oh, I'm all wired up. I don't have my phone to demonstrate, but you know what I mean. So I'm talking and he's going like this. And I wonder if you can imagine what I was thinking. Yeah, I take that. So it wasn't terribly charitable, shall we say. I think the word self-important might have flitted through my mind. So I was making a judgment about his internal state based on external factors. That makes sense? We do that all the time. Most of the time we're really good at it. But I want to try and explain one bias that is known to affect our thinking. So I observed him through my own lens, if you like. I brought myself to the table in interpreting his actions. And I'm going to draw on something that's known as attribution theory. That sounds scarier than it is. Attributions are simply guesses. Okay, for example, I'm making attributions about you at the moment that you're listening. I may or may not be correct, but at the moment you're looking up and you don't look like you've got into your post-lunch sleep yet. So that's an effective attribution. Most of the time, the guesses we make about other people serve us well. I grew up in Glasgow. I learned very young when to cross the street, when not to cross the street, from a very great distance. I'm quite thin, I'm quite weak, I'm not much of a fighter, so, flight was a very effective strategy for survival. So that's carved into my DNA. I went to New York once, and walking along 42nd Street, all my antennae were instantly brought back into play, because I suddenly thought, I think some of this is threatening. So it's carved into our DNA. But it turns out there are probably two types of guesses that I might make, and this is where the bias occurs. What I was doing when I was making my guess, my uncharitable guess, when I used the word self-important, I probably went further. I thought, he thinks his business is more important than anyone else's in this room. That's the type of guy he is. Yeah? Some people are nodding. So I've now got him boxed. That is called an internal attribution. In other words, I am attributing his behavior to a long-term, stable characteristic of that person. If I meet that person tomorrow, I'll know how to deal with them. Okay, that's why it makes sense to us. However, and I could have made another kind of attribution. At the start of today, I realized I was doing it. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and it said, Joe is not in school today, to confess our vulnerabilities, my 17-year-old, who we're trying to keep in 6th year against his will. So, in fact, it turned out that an external factor was what was driving my behavior. So if I'd known the guy better, maybe somebody had said to me, oh, so-and-so, Steve, or whatever his name was, he's a really nice guy. I might have paused slightly. I might have thought, I wonder why he's on the phone while I'm speaking. And I might have started to think about, might there be an external explanation? That's called an external attribution. I might have made that, okay? So these are the two types of attribution. And it would appear many, many experiments have demonstrated that we have a robust tendency to overestimate internal factors. I'm thinking back to family disputes here, she's unreasonable, and underestimate external factors, such as she's having a bad day. And the one we underestimate the most, I think, is ourselves. She's having a bad day and I'm the cause of it. That's a real blind spot I think most of us have in our disputes with other people, in our conflict with other people. So we make the attribution error. That's what it's called. It's called the fundamental attribution error. It's the tendency to think other people's behavior is explained by their nature rather than by external circumstances. Does that make sense? You following me here? Once we make that, one question is, how stupid are we? Well, we're not. So we certainly can correct it. We can make a gut reaction, and then, given a bit of time, we can certainly revise our opinion. As I say, if I learned, maybe I met him the next day and he said, I'm really, really sorry about being on the phone in the middle of that meeting. I had trouble with my kids at school and I had to leave. So I could correct my attribution. But it takes time and it takes cognitive effort. That idea, I think that comes up quite a lot these days. The idea that our brains are not that great at multitasking. It appears. The notion of being cognitively busy has come onto the horizon. It comes from neuroscience as much as anything. So the idea that when our brains are really occupied with one thing, we actually find it quite difficult to focus on something else. Again, lots of experiments have demonstrated this. So in fact, the very time when we might most need to have our wits about us and to be making accurate judgments about other people is often the time when we're least able to do it, when processing demands are high. In other words, if I'm in conflict with you, if I'm harmed by you, that's the very time when I'm least likely to take the time to make a different attribution about your intentions. Now, why is that a problem? Maybe it's accurate, maybe you are a bad guy, and so on. Well, to go back to myself for a moment, here's a lovely quote that seems to capture it. One of the things that I discovered when I was doing a lot of family mediation was that people's behavior towards someone about whom they'd already made up their mind appeared to me to be creating a vicious circle. So in other words, let's take my relationship with this Steve guy. I've made up the name. I don't know him. But supposing I had a meeting with him the next day, I would go into his office, and because of what happened the day before, I just might not be quite as warm and empathic and open as I would normally be. Now, he's in the social world too. He's lived as many years as me, maybe more. He's not daft. He sees that, and he thinks, oh, what's this Charlie guy all about? He behaves a little bit more warily, a bit more suspiciously. I, of course, immediately think, aha, you see, this is what I'm dealing with here. This is the kind of guy. And I think that is one of the loops that many of my clients appeared to be going around. So in their screaming and shouting at each other, I worked with a lot of separating, divorcing people. They had a lot of ammunition, tons of ammunition, but tended to underestimate their own contribution to their ex-partner's behavior. People would spend a lot of time in private discussion with me saying, why? Why does she do this? Why does he do that? And I might be able to say, well, you do this. I mean, that's not how mediators work. That's not necessarily welcome. But I think it captures a very profound truth, that the fundamental attribution error is quite a neat way of understanding the ways in which conflict erupts, the way in which social psychology has given us some insight into some of the ways in which conflict develops. Another way of putting it is, much more straightforwardly, if I expect trouble, I'll get it. Now, just to compound it slightly more, before I move off thoughts onto feelings, another phenomenon that's quite closely related is known as actor-observer differences. So, I've explained how we tend to be towards other people. When it comes to ourselves, we're a lot more charitable, on average. So, I didn't do well in the exam. It's because the teacher was shite. The questions were tough, they didn't prepare us properly. So I then notice all the external circumstances I tend not to notice. I'm a bit idle, I'm very last minute, I didn't do enough work, etc., etc. So the actor-observer difference compounds this problem, that we tend to be more charitable with ourselves. We know our own internal states, whereas when it comes to others, what's much more visible to us is the external state. Okay, so just when you think you're getting used to this, the actor-observer difference makes it all the more tricky to work with. I should say, as a kind of aside, good mental health seems to rely on a degree of this. So people who are really depressed are probably the other way around and notice all the bad things about themselves and don't notice all the good things. So there is a case for saying we should be like this to some extent, but where it can sometimes serve us badly is when we get into conflict with other people. Okay, so how does this all affect? I started with the notion of how conflict affects our thinking, but much like Sarah this morning, I would very, very much buy into the fact that thoughts and feelings are related. In fact, thoughts, feelings, and bodies are related. You can't have one without the other. I'm certainly not going to just leave it at thoughts. So I want to try and tie our perceptions, our thinking, to our emotions, because I'm sure all of us know that emotions play a key role in conflict, in our judgments about conflict. So I'm going to share another insight from psychology. This is a very, very simple idea. In fact, it comes from a book called Crucial Conversations. And if any of you want a kind of pop psychology-sized manual on how to handle difficult conversations, you could do worse than that one. Crucial Conversations, it's nicely written. And they present this idea that in the world, in the social world, in the physical world, there's a path. It's called the path to action between what comes at us. We can't control that most of the time. That guy did what he did. I couldn't control that. If somebody bumps into you in the street, you can't control that. There's external stimulus. That's the triggering event. What that seems to do, it doesn't instantly create an emotion. I used to think it did. It can do in certain settings, but it looks as if what happens in the milliseconds following some triggering event, something happens to me, I make an appraisal. I make a judgment about the source of that event. Is it a threat? Is it something I should be afraid of? Is it something I should be angry or indignant about? Or is it something I should be neutral about? Or is it something I should be pleased about? Somebody runs towards me, looking threatening. You know, should I flinch? Should I run away? When they reach me, they give me a big hug. I just hadn't recognized it's somebody I knew. So the appraisal is very important to the next bit of the journey, which is the emotion appropriate to the appraisal. And I hope you're following me here, that the appraisal really matters. I think I've already covered that if we make the appraisal wrong, then we feel the wrong emotion. If I've made the appraisal that you are my enemy, I'm likely to feel emotions appropriate to that. And once the emotion's felt, well, we can't switch it off. It's very quick, it's very effective. This is evolutionary stuff. Of course it leads to our survival. I've already touched on that. On the street, in the family, wherever you are, you need those emotions, but it's quite hard to switch them off. And I'll talk a little bit more about somatic reactions. So that's what goes on in your body. We all know this. Once you feel frightened, I'm sure you can imagine. In fact, we can summon it up. We could do a little exercise. I could say, just think back to watching a horror film, you know, and we'll not go any further with that, but it's not difficult to summon up the somatic reactions, and they lead to action tendencies. They don't lead to actions, so we do need to understand that. They lead to the possibility. I don't punch everyone in the face when I feel angry. So even action tendencies, there's still human agency entering in. But that, broadly speaking, is a reasonable depiction of how we get from an event in the outside world to our actions, and you'll see that thoughts and emotions are critical. Okay, we're just about out of time here, so there's a quick picture of some emotions. I think I'll just quickly skip over that. And I suppose my fundamental point is that I think many people imagine that the job of mediators is to keep people rational. I often used to hear it from lawyers who would send clients our way and say, well, you know, we want you to help them be reasonable. Because if they could only be reasonable, then everything would be sorted out. All the reading I've done and all the work I've done has convinced me that that's actually a misunderstanding. It's a misreading of the situation. And you'll see that quote about lawyers particularly, not just lawyers. I think it's unfair to pick on them. I think many professionals, their comfort zone would be to try and keep emotions out the room so that we can get on with the real business, on the real rational stuff. Well, it would appear, and this is pretty commonsensical, it's not as easy as that. That distinction between reason and emotion is a very hard distinction to hold. That's a picture. I don't want to go through it in detail, but that's just one emotion. That's the emotion of fear. If you count it up, there are 18 different somatic responses to the fear emotion. So your body is readied in many, many ways to respond to that in perfectly reasonable ways, but they're not necessarily ways that are going to help you to do problem solving, higher maths, difficult problem solving. So this is one of the conundrums that mediators work with all the time, that our clients are emotionally triggered by events and by their interpretation of events, but we're asking them to do tasks that require their wits about them. I think Sarah did talk about the kind of the upper part of our brain and so on, that the bits of our brain that we really need are generally closed down in these emotion-ridden states. And there's some quotes about fear. Fear in particular, not only do we have the fear in front of us, fear also seems to reside. Once we've had it, we don't forget it quickly. It sticks with us, and it's going to affect us for a long time to come. So, just to finish, I quite like, do you mind if I get a water? In fact, I think I've got a microphone on. I can get my water. I've got a couple more minutes. What does this all add up to? I think what I've tried to suggest, I've hinted at one bias in our thinking. If you Google cognitive biases, you'll find over 100 now. So there's a lot more than that. But the basic idea is we do, on occasion, need to help people to reflect on their thinking. We need to create opportunities for people to correct the bias. I'll give you an example. 2 or 3 weeks ago, I did a mediation between colleagues quite grown-up people in a workplace, and they had been in conflict for, let me think, since last June to January. So 6 months, 7 months, they'd been in conflict. In not speaking, one had got to the point of making a formal allegation of bullying. When we spoke about what was the source of this, it went back to a look. Literally a look that was caught out the corner of the more junior person's eye from her manager, the more senior person. She thought it was a look of dismissal and impatience. The manager said, it was a look to a colleague of support, because I knew you were really busy and I knew you were really harassed. But in 7 months, they had never had the opportunity to unpick the incorrect attribution that had been made. Now, that's a very extreme example, but not so unusual. So one of the things that we can do in mediation is help people unpick the attributions they've already made. So sometimes just giving people a chance to hear each other. They don't want to hear it from me, they need to hear it from each other. I think another thing that's really important for all of us in this room, I get this stuff from the High Conflict Institute, by the way, and that's a website that's really, really worth Googling. Have a look at the High Conflict Institute. Even if you're not dealing with people who are typically in high conflict, these are really good tips. So, first of all, don't take it personally. As soon as you show the frustration back, you're fueling the conflict system. What we should be doing when somebody's expressing anger and rage and unreasonableness is actually listen with interest. And the High Conflict Institute people have this little acronym, the EAR approach. Ideally, we want to listen with empathy, we want to pay attention, and we want to respect. Now, I know that's easier said than done. Sarah touched on that earlier. I think we all understand that. When someone's in your face, it's a really difficult thing to do. And one of the ironies that's come my way recently is that those who are most in need of empathy often get the least. I'm sure many of you in this room are living with that truth daily. It's not easy. It's really, really not easy to do. To be empathic towards someone who's not empathic towards you is a real challenge. But I think the premium, the bonus of all this is that will eventually reduce the emotional arousal given time, and that person can then get on with the problem solving, which we're all capable of doing. People know how to work things out. They may need help, they may need support. And finally, sometimes we're dealing with really unreasonable people. Okay, there are people who are not just averagely angry. I'm averagely angry. But sometimes I can be really, really unreasonable. And so here's a couple of tips from the High Conflict Institute. The first is, in those kind of situations, don't worry about helping them see. That's not the nature of the game at this point. When you're dealing with somebody who's very emotionally aroused, insight is not the business that we're in. What we're actually in the business of is problem solving. And so one of the most useful things to do when we're in that is to keep giving that person agency. Keep giving that person their say. And yeah, okay, I hear that, I know about that, but what would you like to do? What are you going to do? I know that will flummox some people and that will be difficult for some people, but this is the best I can do in a very short 20 minutes to say, when you look on the High Conflict Institute website, I found that tip incredibly helpful in dealing with some of my clients who I thought were struggling to respond to normal ideas. So when we're faced with high conflict, don't focus on insight, but rather just look for practical problem solving. And I think this is the work that mediators intuitively do. So having romped through a bit of social psychology, a bit of neuroscience, I just really want to finish by, I suppose, thanking you all for not sitting fiddling on your phone. And if you did, I would come up to you afterwards and charitably ask. I'm sure there was some very, very good excuse for it. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlie. And I'm just checking my own phone, but I want to say thank you again just for a really captivating discussion. And we also have the opportunity to open up to the floor now, because we have a real opportunity here in that we live very, very busy lives and we have our own responsibilities, of which can be very challenging and demanding all at the same time. However, what we've got here, and something we're very proud of at the Scottish Centre of Conflict Resolution, is we've really got the knowledge and the research here. And I know by the very fact that none of you were looking at your phones means that there's something here. And if we are to tie in where we're at about how we break down some of the mould or the obstacles that are to people engaging in dealing with conflict, taking on an awful lot of the thoughts and the feelings around what Charlie's presentation looked like, is there anyone that has a question that could be helpful for you back in where you've left for the day in terms of your workplace responsibilities or even your personal lives? But to open the floor, and Caroline and Duncan have got microphones if you require. Abby.
Thanks. If you were to kind of give people in the room today a couple of tips to practically help ourselves correct our own biases and to help other people to correct them, what would they be?
That's a great question. Yeah, de-biasing. And there's been some effort to study that. So, I mean, the simple answer is data. More data. You know, generally, we're operating on narrow slivers of information. So if we expand the amount of information in the room, we're more likely to get it right. So you can rarely go wrong by asking. So that, I mean, that's a simple answer, but I think there's a lot in that. And then, if you really want to go further in de-biasing, ask someone else. Ask someone else who you know and trust. What do you really think about what I think? Or what do you think my adversary might think? And it's remarkable how much it turns out you and your group know about the other side if you put your mind to it.
Very good. Thank you. Anyone else?
You have a question?
Well, basically, I was thinking about the external attributions, because I work mostly on the phone, and so is there any way that you can get? I mean, I know that there are plenty of ways you can understand how people are feeling through the tone of their voice.
Yep.
But is it harder that way?
I mean, the answer is, of course, it's harder, but we're really good at it. I mean, we spend a lot of time on the phone, and if you spend a lot of time on the phone, I think we're quite good at giving non-visual cues to other people, little verbal tics even, that are saying, that tells a person I'm well-intentioned towards you, and I listen. There's great work by a woman called Elizabeth Stokoe in Loughborough University on telephone mediation work. And she has a principle, she's got a lovely presentation where if there's a gap of longer than a second, she has tumbleweed coming across the presentation. So silence is really problematic on the phone because people will read bad stuff into it. So I think you can certainly help manage your own contribution. Other people's, a wee bit harder, but again, probably more data. Yeah. If something's ambiguous, ask.
Actually, we've also learned that sometimes silence is a really big help because it lets the other person think about what what they just said, think about things a little bit more where you're not putting your own self onto them.
Have you heard of behavior labeling?
No.
Which is a technique that I think a lot of people intuitively do, where you might say, I'm going to pause here. So you say what you're about to do, or do you mind if I ask a question? Or do you mind if I make a statement? It's just quite a clever little trick to flag up what's about to happen. And that sometimes, we probably do it instinctively, but it can be helpful.
If I may ask a question, one of the conversations that's come up today is in terms of how do we get people who feel guilt or shame talking about conflict in their lives. What would your advice be in terms of the practitioners we have in front of us today to be able to take something that can help address that cultural, societal challenge in Scotland?
I mean, I don't think there are any slick tips. I would always feel that if somebody chose to talk to me about shame, that was an incredible honour that had to be earned and that I should be really, really careful with. I think that would have been my starting point. It's not something I expect. I wouldn't demand that of anyone. I think it's an invitation. However, I think I would say that in mediation, because the other person's there, that brings things into the room that have to be dealt with, and that's not a bad thing. I think you learn not to shy away. So it's not me bringing it, but sometimes because the conflict's happening in front of you, that does force people to consider the difficult stuff. And I think that's my tip to mediators is we have to learn not to shy away from the tough stuff.
Great stuff. Charlie, thank you very, very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.